and who spoke slowly with no motion of the hand, as if his utterances were the condensed wisdom of the ages. "Inspector Standish," I cried, "is it within your power to arrest a man on suspicion?" "Of course it is," he replied, "but we must harbour the suspicion before we make the arrest." "Have confidence in me," I exclaimed. "The man who committed the Greenwich Park murder is an Italian named Felini." I gave the address of the exact room in which he was to be found, with cautions regarding the elusive nature of this individual. I said that he had been 3 times in my custody, and those 3 times he had slipped through my fingers. I have since thought that Inspector Standish did not credit a word I had spoken. "What is your proof against this Italian?" asked the inspector slowly. "The proof is on the body of the murdered man, but, nevertheless, if you suddenly confront Felini with me, without giving him any hint of whom he is going to meet, you shall have the evidence from his own lips before he recovers from his surprise and fright." Something of my confidence must have impressed the official, for the order of arrest was made. Now, during the absence of the constable sent to bring in Felini, I explained to the inspector fully the details of my plan. Practically he did not listen to me, for his head was bent over a writing pad, on which I thought he was taking down my remarks, but when I had finished he went on writing as before, so I saw I had flattered myself unnecessarily. More than 2 hours passed before the constable returned, bringing with him the trembling Italian. I swung round in front of him and cried in a menacing voice, "Felini, regard me. You know Valmont too well to trifle with him. What have you to say of the murder in Greenwich Park?" I give you my word that the Italian collapsed, and would have fallen to the floor in a heap had not the constables upheld him with hands under each arm. His face became of a pasty whiteness, and he began to stammer his confession, when this incredible thing happened, which could not be believed in France. Inspector Standish held up his finger. "One moment," he cautioned solemnly. "Remember that whatever you say will be used against you." The quick, beady black eyes of the Italian shot from Standish to me, and from me to Standish. In an instant his alert mind grasped the situation. Metaphorically, I had been waved aside. I was not there in any official capacity, and he saw in a moment with what an opaque intellect he had to deal. The Italian closed his mouth like a steel trap and refused to utter a word. Shortly after he was liberated, as there was no evidence against him. When at last complete proof was in the tardy hands of the British authorities, the agile Felini was safe in the Apennine Mountains, and today is serving a life sentence in Italy for the assassination of a senator whose name I have forgotten. Is it any wonder that I threw up my hands in despair at finding myself among such a people? But this was in the early days, and now that I have greater experience of the English, many of my first opinions have been modified. I mention all this to explain why, in a private capacity, I often did what no English official would dare to do. A people who will send a policeman without even a pistol to protect him, to arrest a desperate criminal in the most dangerous quarter of London, cannot be comprehended by any native of France, Italy, Spain, or Germany. When I began to succeed as a private detective in London, and had accumulated money enough for my project, I determined not to be hampered by this unexplainable softness of the English toward an accused person. I therefore reconstructed my flat, and placed in the centre of it a dark room strong as any Bastille cell. It was 12 feet square, and contained no furniture except a number of shelves, a lavatory in one corner, and a pallet on the floor. It was ventilated by 2 flues from the centre of the ceiling, in one of which operated an electric fan, which, when the room was occupied, sent the foul air up that flue, and drew down fresh air through the other. The entrance to this cell opened out from my bedroom, and the most minute inspection would have failed to reveal the door, which was of massive steel, and was opened and shut by electric buttons that were partially concealed by the head of my bed. Even if they had been discovered, they would have revealed nothing, because the first turn of the button lit the electric light at the head of my bed. The second turn put it out, and this would happen as often as the button was turned to the right. But turn it 3 times slowly to the left, and the steel door opened. Its juncture was completely concealed by panelling. I have brought many a scoundrel to reason within the impregnable walls of that small room. Those who know the building regulations of London will wonder how it was possible for me to delude the government inspector during the erection of this section of the Bastille in the midst of the modern metropolis. It was the simplest thing in the world. Liberty of the subject is the first great rule with the English people, and thus many a criminal is allowed to escape. Here was I laying plans for the contravening of this first great rule, and to do so I took advantage of the second great rule of the English people, which is that property is sacred. I told the building authorities I was a rich man with a great distrust of banks, and I wished to build in my flat a safe or strong room in which to deposit my valuables. I built, then, such a room as may be found in every bank and many private premises of the city, and a tenant might have lived in my flat for a year and never suspected the existence of this prison. A railway engine might have screeched its whistle within it, and not a sound would have penetrated the apartments that surrounded it, unless the door were open. But besides Monsieur Eugene Valmont, dressed in elegant attire as if he were still a boulevardier of Paris, occupier of the top floor in the Imperial Flats, there was another Frenchman in London to whom I must introduce you, namely Professor Paul Ducharme, who occupied a squalid back room in the cheapest and most undesirable quarter of Soho. Valmont flatters himself he is not yet middle-aged, but poor Ducharme does not need his sparse grey beard to proclaim his advancing years. Valmont vaunts an air of prosperity. Ducharme wears the shabby habiliments and the shoulder-stoop of hopeless poverty. He shuffles cringingly along the street, a compatriot not to be proud of. There are so many Frenchmen anxious to give lessons in their language that merely a small living is to be picked up by any one of them. You will never see the spruce Valmont walking alongside the dejected Ducharme. Ah, you exclaim, Valmont in his prosperity has forgotten those less fortunate of his nationality. Pardon, my friends, it is not so. Behold, I proclaim to you the exquisite Valmont and the threadbare Ducharme are one and the same person. That is why they do not promenade together, and indeed it requires no great histrionic art on my part to act the rôle of the miserable Ducharme, for when I first came to London I warded off starvation in this wretched room, and my hand it was that nailed to the door the painted sign, Professor Paul Ducharme, Teacher of the French Language. I never gave up the room, even when I became prosperous and moved to Imperial Flats, with its concealed chamber of horrors unknown to British authority. I did not give up the Soho chamber principally for this reason. Paul Ducharme, if the truth were known about him, would have been regarded as a dangerous character. Yet this was a character sometimes necessary for me to assume. He was a member of the very inner circle of the International, an anarchist of the anarchists. This malign organisation has its real headquarters in London, and we who were officials connected with the Secret Service of the Continent have more than once cursed the complacency of the British Government, which allows such a nest of vipers to exist practically unmolested. I confess that before I came to know the English people as well as I do now, I thought that this complacency was due to utter selfishness, because the anarchists never commit an outrage in England. England is the one spot on the map of Europe where an anarchist cannot be laid by the heels unless there is evidence against him that will stand the test of open court. Anarchists take advantage of this fact, and plots are hatched in London which are executed in Paris, Berlin, Petersburg, or Madrid. I know now that this leniency on the part of the British Government does not arise from craft, but from their